Welcome to the session on the intersectionality of transfusion medicine with transplantation. The objectives will be to discuss the quantities involved in the transfusion support of transplantation and to speak to the blood matching and immunohematologic challenges or the qualities involved in transfusion support. And finally, to go over special needs or modifications relevant to the transfusion support of transplanted patients. In some background, Ontario accounts for about 40% of transfusion and transplantation activity in Canada. And in rough numbers, we perform a similar number of solid organ transplants as stem cell transplants, so about 1,000 of each year. Shown here in the pink icons are the Ontario cities that have bone marrow transplant capacity. And in blue markers here are those that perform solid organ transplants. We all appreciate that the demand for solid organ transplants far exceeds the available supply, and that the commonest transplants performed are kidneys, followed by livers, and then lungs, hearts, and GI tracts or portions thereof. Transplants come in unrelated and related donors, and the unrelateds who are deceased are majority neurologic death donors as opposed to death after circulatory or cardiac death. 68% of living donors are the related kind. In stem cell transplants, the autologous variety focus on those with myeloma and or lymphoma. And with allogeneic or allo-BMTs, we're looking at the remaining hematolymphoid neoplasms, namely the leukemias, MDS, myelofibrosis, and so forth. Syngeneic transplants, those involving twins, are very rare. So only about 1% of people have a twin, and only a third of those represent identical twins. And a problem with, of course, identical transplantation is not having the benefit of graft versus leukemia effect or enough disparity for other antigens to be picked on by the donor allograft. So with excess similarity comes the background genetic risk that led to the original malignancy, as well as the loss of some graft versus leukemia effect. The ratio of auto to allo is roughly 3-to-1. And autos are really about setting the clock back. So these are not curative intent, but allo-BMTs are truly a great reset. These are almost like Control-Alt-Delete maneuvers. And so with the benefit of graft versus leukemia or lymphoma effect, there's the price of some graft versus host disease. Among allo-BMTs, you've got MUDs and relateds. And the matched unrelated donors come either from adults or from umbilical cord blood transplants. The related kind are matched sibling related donor at a high level match, but otherwise, and increasingly, we have haplomatches from other first degree relatives, parents, sibs, or children. So all directions in the pedigree eligible. None of this would have been possible without transfusion medicine paving the way. And so the question raised now by these new ventures in medicine is how much blood gets used in either of these contexts? And are we using this appropriately, or can it be used better? Of course, it all began with red cells. And these were challenges in space and time. The anticoagulant citrate allowed red cells to be separated from donors, keeping the material anticoagulated. And the nutrient dextrose allowed red cells to be stored over longer periods. And so the storage durations of red cells have shifted from 3 to 5 to 6 weeks in accordance with advances in the supernatant additive storage solutions. In the early 20th century, blood transfusion or blood banking got refined. And in the mid-20th century, syngeneic and autologous transplants, followed by matched sibling-related donor and matched unrelated donor transplants occurred decade by decade. In the 1980s, stem cell registries were built and globalization and generalization were achieved. In the 1990s, the next development was reduced intensity or non-myeloablative stem cell transplants, herein increasing the scope of eligible recipients from reducing the toxicity of the conditioning regimens. And then in the 2000s, cord blood and haploidentical transplants really took off, again, further increasing the donor scope. Similarly, with solid organ transplants, these dawned in the 50s and 60s, first with kidneys and then livers, lungs, hearts, and bowel. Solid organ transplants are a somewhat bloody enterprise, and certainly on a spectrum. So when we look at our UHN data from about 10 years ago, 64% of our red cells go to Toronto General, and 30% of those Toronto General red cells go to the OR, with 30% of those OR case uses in solid organ transplant contexts. So that works out to about 2,000 units of red cells per year going to the bodies of people receiving solid organs. Kidneys, comprising a third of our transplants, use less than 10% of our transplant-related blood use. On the other hand, livers represent really coagulopathic cases. So they're about a third of our transplants, but up to 50% of transplant-related blood use, with an average of 7 units of red cells per case. And lung transplants, as well as heart transplants, those that get bridged with extracorporeal life support, also tend to go through quite a bit of blood. So lungs are about a fifth of our transplants or a quarter of our transplants. And these would use about a third of our blood with 5 to 8 units per case. Hearts represent a small minority of our transplant activity, but disproportionately more blood use. With stem cell transplants, the blood use is stretched out over time. The amount of blood use required depends on how harsh the conditioning regimen was, how hematopoietic stem cells got infused, and how many complications occurred in that pre-engraftment period, as well as how much mismatch there might have been. And so this speaks to the times to various kinds of cellular engraftment. The time to neutrophil engraftment, defined by the neutrophil count exceeding 0.5 for 3 consecutive days, ranges anywhere from about 2 weeks to 6 weeks. The time to platelet engraftment, defined as the reaching of a platelet count of 20 to 50 and having freedom from transfusion for over a week, runs anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks to 8 weeks. The time to red cell engraftment runs the longest, and that's defined as the last red cell before more than 1 to 2 months of red cell transfusion freedom. So about a month to several months. You can look at transplants as well in terms of the immunosuppression versus myelosuppression axis. And so we exert a lot more immunosuppression for haploidentical BMTs and T cell depleted grafts. Myelosuppression, of course, runs the gamut from non-myeloablative to myeloablative. So some of the conditioning agents are shown here in their abbreviated form. The predicted number of platelets and red cells required to support a person in their pre-engraftment period depends on the institution and era you're examining. And so this is a moving target based on what literature you're looking at to cite. So in older literature, the typical number of adult platelet doses supporting a BMT was as high as 8, but trending down towards 6. And similar trends have been seen in red cell utilization. So about a dozen per stem cell transplant, down to 10, and more recently down to 6. And so again, a lot of this depends on how conservative an institution may be in its triggering standards and what the nature is of the BMT itself in terms of depths of anemia caused by the conditioning regimen. The umbilical cord blood transplant or cord blood transplant is a population that is increasing. This predominates in pediatrics where you can get away with a single dose, but in adults you tend to need to use up to 3 grafts. And even though you're using 3 grafts that might have disparate blood types, there's typically just one winner. So one engrafts and seems to depend on the existence of a cheering section, so to speak. Rich Haspel and others have shown that the predicted engraftment blood type might very well be the first one that gets infused, so the one that opportunistically fills the niche first. Challenges with these transplants include longer times to engraftment and immune reconstitution failure because cords have come from newborns or fetuses. And of course, these have not yet had full immune system development as yet. How has Canada contributed to the relevant trigger literature in transplantation? Well, we could cite the TRICS study to help guide our triggering practices in solid organ transplantation. And we can cite the TRIST study in BMT. The TRICS-3 study examined hemoglobin triggers of less than 75 versus less than 95 in the OR or ICU period and less than 85 once graduated to the ward. And so that would be your conservative versus your liberal arms. And this was a cardiac surgery context, but surgical nonetheless, with over 5,000 patients enrolled and a study period from induction to the 28-day point. The primary endpoint was death, MI, stroke, or renal replacement therapy requirement, and there was non-inferiority demonstrated for conservative versus liberal triggering. The mortality was also similar. But what jumped out here in this plot was this clear statistical disadvantage that actually sided with restrictive thresholds being better in people over the age of 75. So it goes without saying that this was a bit of a surprise for many readers because this was a counterintuitive or unexpected result. The TRIST study, which examined triggers in hematopoietic cellular transplants between day 0 and 100, therefore speaking to both the inpatient and outpatient treatment period, involved 300 recipients at 4 sites, half auto and half allo. The trigger was less than 70 in the conservative versus less than 90 in the liberal arm. And the primary endpoint here was non-inferiority for health-related quality of life in the FACT BMT score. There was no difference in the fatigue level of people triggering conservatively versus liberally. And other endpoints included the amount of blood used, and this hit a trend for a possible difference 4 units versus 2 units of red cells used, and a delta of 13.7 grams per liter. There were no outcome differences for treatment-related mortality, length of stay, ICU, acute graft versus host disease, the percentage or the severity, serious infections, Biermann toxicity, or veno-occlusive disease. Now for quality issues, we're talking here about graft and product matching. There are red cell systems to consider. These may manifest in hemolysis or aplasia, depending on what kind of incompatibility is at play. ABO is our major system, with RHD and other minor antigens also potentially playing a role with respect to mismatch immunohematologic sequelae. For platelet systems, chief concern is platelet refractoriness. And while ABO similarity is of value, here the real system of concern that dominates is HLA, with sometimes HPA. Product modifications relate to whether we're irradiating and if so, for how long, and what the impact is of GVHD mitigation. So histocompatibility systems and terms in solid organ and stem cell transplant. Unfortunately, there's some confusion with the nomenclature here. When we speak of systems, major versus minor systems are ABO and HLA versus RHD and others, respectively. But when we are talking about polarities and relationships or compatibility, your choices are identical versus major mismatch and minor mismatch. And so that's speaking more to donor or cellular alien antigens versus donor plasmatic antibodies in relation to the host. Major histocompatibility barriers, ABO and HLA. These are the major systems when it comes to solid organ transplantation. ABO is major because we have these innate or naturally occurring antithetical isoagglutinins. We are preset with incompatibilities, and so it's harder to cross the ABO barrier when it comes to transplanting solid organs that have a high density of expression. Stem cells, fortunately, do not express ABO at a high density, so therefore we get away with not matching for ABO at a stem cell level. But the problems come downstream as erythropoiesis tries to take off from that graft, and so red cell engraftment may be delayed or suppressed because of any ongoing recipient side isoagglutinins, especially if the transplant is not fully ablative. HLA is really important on the stem cell side, but less important on the solid organ transplant side, especially if this recipient doesn't have donor-specific antibodies in their HLA repertoire, should they even have pre-existing seroconversions. So acquired donor-specific antibodies may or may not be present, but if they are, well, then they will represent important immune barriers to cross. You can see here that there are some slight differences in how solid organ transplanters and bone marrow transplanters regard notions of ABO compatibility. So for solid organ transplants, ABO matters more than HLA, but again in stem cell, HLA matters more than ABO. For solid organ transplant, it's just a binary. Are you ABO compatible or not? In stem cells, there are 4 classifications for these ABO relationships, and all of them are eligible to occur without a lot of differences in how those grafts are managed or conditioned up front. But at the end of the day, they set up our expectations on what syndromes may be followed or what immunohematologic sequelae may exist in the weeks or months ahead. So there are parallels between the transfusion lab and the histocompatibility or HLA testing lab. In the blood bank, where the kernel of our work is grouping or typing, and the next orbital is screening, and then serologic cross-matching. The HLA lab has, by analogy, of course, service to us in platelet transfusion refractoriness investigations and service to solid organ transplanters and stem cell transplanters. The analogy or the analog of this orbital idea is HLA typing is akin to our grouping, and getting the PRA is akin to our screening. So this is the HLA unbiased and donor-specific antigen or relevant HLA antibody testing, the characterization of all of the specificities and the specificities that are important to the graft at hand. Cross-matching answers the question about whether the proposed organ is indeed compatible. And so lymphocyte or virtual cross-matches are equivalent in meaning to the various kinds of blood cross-matching that we do in the blood bank. This is speaking materially to the graft that you are proposing for the patient. Now in BMT, we're illustrating here a mother and a father to a given patient. And as you could see, SIB1 is the most ideal match because SIB1 has the same maternally and paternally inherited haplotype as the patient. But if you don't have a SIB1 10 out of 10 match, who might your next best haplo matches be? And so you could see that mother is also defined not only by the inherited maternal antigen type or the father by the inherited paternal antigen type, but by NEMA and EPA, which is the non-inherited maternal allele and the non-inherited paternal allele. And so between these siblings, there is a hierarchy for who's best after HLA identical and who's coming close to the worst scenario of complete HLA mismatch, where you only have a NEMA and an EPA. So after EMA-EPA is the NEMA-EPA scenario, the non-inherited maternal allele with the inherited paternal allele, and that would be SIB3. For HLA sensitization, there are some prices to pay. It's not just platelet transfusion refractoriness, but potential problems with graft rejection. So you have the problem of febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reactions, which are the consequence of host side HLA sensitization. Platelet transfusion refractoriness, likewise, the more sensitized a host is, the likelier they are to reject HLA unmatched platelets. And in people who are heavily pre-armed with HLA sensitization repertoires, there is a risk of early ICU after stem cell transplantation. And obviously, if there are graft-relevant or donor-specific antibodies, increased risks of stem cell transplant and solid organ transplant graft failure. So how is the PRA done? How do we do HLA antibody screening? The PRA, of course, gives us a sense of the probability of a positive cross-match, but sometimes high PRAs don't always match to bad news with respect to the graft's particular specificities. But our characterization of the patient's trouble begins with HLA antibody screening. In the old days, this was a cell-based complement-dependent cytotoxicity assay. There would be a plate or a panel full of unique donor lymphocytes, and the percentage of random donor lymphocytes that a particular intended recipient serum would interact with and destroy would give you a computed percentage. So the percent reactive activity is essentially an anti-population hostility score. The complement is added, and the cytotoxicity is seen as cell death, so cell lysis being indicated by fluorescence in these particular assays. What took over and what enabled inter-site standardization so that scores in one location meant the same thing as scores at another. Because obviously, your lymphocyte panel in one city might be very different from the lymphocyte panel in another. The breakthrough here is the use of standardized HLA embedded flow beads. So this is a solid phase-based ELISA or a flow cytometric Luminex assay where you have colorimetric identities of different beads and beads known to be embedded with specific HLA antigens. And a person's anti-HLA antibodies interact specifically with a given bead, and then an anti-human globulin fluorochrome highlights those beads that have had antibodies landing upon them. And herein is the construction through the computer of a waterfall plot showing not only the list of all the specificities, but the strengths of those reactions in mean fluorescence indices. And so that's what's shown here. And you could see that there are these cutoffs between what defines strong versus moderate versus weak or questionable reactivities. Now, to examine for donor-specific antibodies, one needs to know the HLA type of the intended graft. and then to pick out which specificities from the PRA line up with those cognate antigens. If there are donor-specific antibodies, then it's of use to run T cell and B cell cross matches. And here we're using the lymphocytes of the intended donor. So when organs are retrieved, blood specimens are retrieved from those donors as well, and those arrive at the histocompatibility lab. T cells isolated from those donors will give information on class 1 incompatibility, and B cell selected subpopulations will speak to class 2 DRD-PDQ incompatibilities. So the flow cross-match will use the donor lymphocyte, your patient's serum, and then of course, again, an anti-human globulin that may be fluorescent or have an anti-IgG fluorescent antibody to illustrate binding of this sandwich setup. Now, if you are upfront sensitized, meaning there are donor-specific antibodies that will predict for host versus graft effects or rejection, you might be able to overcome them in a number of ways. And that may be to increase or enhance immunomodulation, so-called desensitization maneuvers, or you can put the patient and their donor through a living donor paired exchange. So if there's a sequence of donors out there, one of which might be better suited to your recipient, and likewise, your patient's intended donor better suited for someone else, you can get these grafts retrieved at the same time and domino them out to the best recipient. Then there's also the idea of acceptable mismatching. So you might have an imperfect HLA match, but as long as the HLA repertoire that is presented, though not identical, is not yet or currently a target for the antibody repertoire of the recipient, well, then that graft may be able to go in and not necessarily induce new sensitization responses, especially if there's good immunosuppression on board. Now back to the ABO system. This was a very famous solid organ transplant horror story. Jessica Santillan was a Mexican national who came into the United States as a Group O person with a failing heart. And it was the intention of her mother to have her taken care of in the United States, where the standard of healthcare was a lot higher. And so through the church group, funds were raised for her health care. And indeed, she proceeded to have a heart transplant at Duke University, but unfortunately was accidentally transplanted with a Group A heart. Unfortunately, it wasn't until post-op day 11 that the public apology was made with an appeal for help to find another graft. She was retransplanted on February 20th, but by then was probably already brain dead. So the ABO barrier is not easily crossed. As mentioned, it can be crossed by accident. But nowadays, we are placing ABO mismatched grafts, but with some preemptive and careful maneuverings. There might be differences in conditioning, and there may be selections of lower expression grafts so that we minimize the harms of that major mismatched transplant. In addition to HLA and ABO, there are minor histocompatibility antigen systems, some of the names of which are shown here on the left. And from our minor antigens session, you will recall that some red cell antigens are also differentially expressed across other solid organ systems. And so you've learned that in the kidney, Colton, Duffy, and Kidd are also co-expressed. And in the liver, Scheider-Rogers is co-expressed. In the heart, KEL is co-expressed. And so these may be meaningful minor histocompatibility antigen systems. If your intended recipient is red cell antibody screen positive on their group and screen for a relevant antigen system that is cross-expressed in the organ of transplant interest. We have names for abiochimera. We have a 3-digit nomenclature at UHN, beginning with the prefix X for solid organ transplants and the prefix T for stem cell transplants. The first position after the X is the blood type that the host was born with, and the next position after that is the blood type of the intended donor. So an XOA is a person who was born O and transplanted to A. Likewise, a TAB is a person born A and transplanted with a B graft, a bidirectional mismatch. So the heart of these truth tables is to avoid plasma-containing products or plasmas that are minor mismatched in relation to the graft. In a TOA, we would not want to give a plasma that brings an additional anti-A, lest it harm an attempted group A engraftment. So we've seen these stem cell archetypes in our ABO session, but I'll bring these back up again. The TOA, let's say Joan, who is a major incompatible stem cell transplant, suffers delayed red cell engraftment or pure red cell aplasia. A person born O, who might still be elaborating hemolytic anti-A, may continue to have antibodies against that germinally forming group A graft and its erythropoiesis. So this predicts for a red cell adoption failure. Acute hemolysis, if there's a big contaminating red cell load in that group A transplant at infusion time, and delayed establishment of active red cell production. That's in contrast with a plasma incompatible or minor incompatible stem cell transplant. Here, you'll see a delayed and potentially severe hemolytic anemia depending on how much residual host erythroid biomass there is. So in TAO, Naomi, well, donor antibodies may hemolyze those residual red cells. If there's a lot of plasma contamination of the graft at infusion, the group O donor may have a lot of hemolytic anti-A and produce some hemolysis at the graft's infusion time. And again, delayed hemolysis as passenger lymphocyte activity occurs from that group O graft. You've seen this table before, and this again speaks to what the best various component ABO types are. The thread that is most useful is the group O erythrocyte for ABO mismatches. And if you have an antigen in common, well, then you can deviate from O by giving that shared antigen. Platelets, ideally isoagglutinin free for what is harmful to the donor or the recipient. And so A is just fine for a TOA or a TAO. This will be free of the anti-A, which means that you won't harm the donor or the recipient. The next choice are your ABs. Of course, these have no isoagglutinins, but then produce cellular incompatibility with respect to the party that might still have residual isoagglutinins. We don't flip the platelet ABO type over until host red cells disappear. Okay, so until the vulnerable host red cell type is gone, we do not want to bring in isoagglutinins that could cause hemolysis. Frozen plasma, AB, is to these mismatches what group O red cells are to them. So AB is the isoagglutinin depleted plasma that is most suitable for these mismatched pairs. Now platelets, because they're dual products, bring complicated incompatibilities. If you aren't giving ABO identical platelets, and of course those are ideal because they are both suitable at a cellular and plasma level, well then you're giving something that's violating the recipient at one or another level. So ABO non-identical or disparate platelets are either major incompatible, which means a cellular disparity that is up for attack, or plasma incompatible, minor incompatible, meaning the recipient may hemolyze, or both, bidirectionally incompatible. Your increment might be blunted from a major mismatched platelet, but the minor mismatched platelet might cause hemolysis, and that's especially true for the group O platelet or the GOP. That's what's deadly. So biologically, the least desirable platelet mismatch is actually the minor as opposed to the major. And with bidirectional mismatch, because A's and B's tend to make IgMs rather than IgGs towards each other, these might actually be less damaging, even though there's a double jeopardy situation here compared to the hemolytic firepower of a group O that contains not just IgMs, but IgGs at potentially high titers. So for RHD, what matters most and what do we serve? So just as we have a nomenclature for mismatched pairs in ABO terms, we also have a chimeric nomenclature in our lab information system for D mismatches. We call it a TPN if you're born RHD positive and transplanted with an RHD negative donor. And we call it TNP if you're born RHD negative and transplanted with an RHD positive donor. It is the TPN mismatch that is the one most prone to D seroconversion. You've seen a version of this figure before when we were speaking to the RH system. While D is not graft relevant, it is of importance for those recipients who are conscious of a future risk of HDFN, so people who might still want to engage in childbearing. So you look at your scenario-based conversion odds to determine how much attention you pay to giving a particular recipient the attention of D negative products. And this includes some recognition of the fact that grafts coming from RHD positive donors, which may have contaminating RHD erythrocytes within them, may also be forces for seroconversion. Now, transplanted individuals are, of course, immune suppressed so as to enable tolerance of the graft. This doesn't completely eliminate the risk of D seroconversion. And so there may be a role then in D mismatched transplants, X and Ps, to give Rh immune globulin to protect the recipient from D seroconversion from the red cell content of that transplant. Again, though platelets don't express RHD themselves, there's a small amount of contaminating erythroid biomass in a platelet bag that might warrant Rh immune prophylaxis for neutralization. Now we can see passenger lymphocyte syndromes, like the Naomi scenario, in solid organ transplants too. When we looked at almost 3,000 transplants, and we were doing about a solid organ transplant per day on average at UHN, we had about 14 cases, or about 2 per year, is about 0.5%. So in almost 3,000 transplants, 9% of which were minor ABO incompatible or minor mismatched, compatible from the solid organ transplanter's perspective, because O's are perfectly suitable to give to A's, but those O grafts could secrete anti-A. And so when we had ABO minor or plasma mismatch setups, we found that 8 out of those 274, or about 3% of the minor mismatches, produced ABO passenger lymphocyte syndromes of the Naomi variety. These were disproportionate in lymphoid-rich grafts. So we had 4 of these cases occurring in lungs and 4 of these occurring in livers, but not in our kidneys or our drier grafts, so to speak. And you can see what some of the transfers or passenger lymphocyte immunohematologies were. So in addition to anti-A's, we had some anti-D's and other minor red cell antibodies coming across. The durations of these passenger lymphocyte effects are shown here in the upper right-hand corner. So not all of these were clinically significant, and not all of them lined up with hemolytic activity according to the serologic abnormality that was detected. Now let's go back to platelets. Okay. They are cells suspended in plasma. On the cellular side, platelets express ABO, HLA, as well as their own specific antigen system, the human platelet alloantigen system, and herein are the platelet glycoproteins, like glycoprotein 2b3a or glycoprotein 1b9. We have naturally occurring antibodies against ABO, and we have acquired donor-specific antibodies to HLA and HPA, depending on what a host's prior exposures were. The plasma in a platelet may contain ABO isoagglutinins and may also contain HLA or HNA antibodies if the donor of the plasma of that platelet is sensitized to either of these leukocyte antigen systems. HNA is the human neutrophil alloantigen system. In pink, the anti-leukocyte antibodies are the ones that are trollygenic. So you could see that there's a lot of incompatibility pathology that may exist within a platelet product. Platelets are the subject of refractoriness in some recipients. Platelet transfusion refractoriness, immune-mediated, meaning a failure of the increment in the 1-hour post-platelet transfusion count, 90% of the time is serologically based on an attack of the HLA system. And what drives this is not so much the diversity or the mismatch of the platelet cells themselves, but the content of leukocytes in a product, as shown in the famous TRAP study published by Cheryl Slister in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1997. So control or non-leukoreduced platelet products had a 40% cumulative percentage of lymphocytotoxic antibody positivity, but you could bring the rate of HLA sensitization down to the same level, down by 50% to 20% by any process that would reduce the leukocyte content of the product. And that would be apheresis collection, which is a process leukoreduction intrinsic to the physics of the process of apheresis collection of platelets is spinning off the leukocytes in the process. Filtration of platelet concentrates for leukoreduction, and UVB treatment to eliminate the viable leukocytes in the product. Again, any maneuver, red, purple, or green, will reduce the risk of HLA sensitization. So this is clearly revealing that sensitization is evangelized by the white cell content of the product. The structural matching concept speaks to permissive mismatching. When it comes to trying to find an HLA matched product, you can be so strict as to demand an HLA identical donor, of which there are very few typically, or you can select with intolerance predicting donors. So people who, though they might be HLA disparate, exhibit HLA types that are within cross-reactive or tolerance predicting groups. And then you can open up to the widest number of donors by at least avoiding targets of the current antibody repertoire. So give permissive mismatches to antigens that the patient isn't currently or ever yet sensitized to. Yes, you may develop future seroconversions, but at least at the current time, given that platelets exist in vivo for only a short period after transfusion, you have this window of opportunity to give some permissive mismatches before the next wave of sensitization occurs. This interesting paper spoke not only to humorally mediated platelet transfusion refractoriness, which can be founded on attacks of the platelet HLA or HPA system, but to T cell mediated platelet transfusion refractoriness. So right now, our bias or our focus of activity is to circumvent the antibody repertoire or to assume that platelet refractoriness is a humorally based process. But that may be incorrect, and we may be missing other opportunities to overcome refractoriness by failing to address the T cell side of this direct platelet destruction. So, this is akin to appreciating just how important T cells are as well in ITP. Whereas maybe 2/3 to 3/4 of ITP may be B cell mediated, we can't forget the fact that the remaining proportion may be T cell mediated, and that might be worth focusing on or working on to get the patient through. How do we make sense of the harm? How do we make sense of the fact that platelets are so reactogenic? Platelets associate frequently with adverse events. We quote a 10% risk of any kind of a reaction rate with every platelet confrontation. And this is a helpful conversation to have if we believe that a trigger is problematic or over liberal, especially if we're dealing with a platelet shortage and we have to limit who's getting our remaining inventory. So, by reminding people of the reactogenicity of platelets, we can dissuade them from seeking that product if it isn't truly indicated. FNHTRs, allergic reactions, bacterial contaminations, and trolley are all risks that are heightened in platelet transfusions. Why is that? Well, we've spoken to the complexity of the platelet in both of the cellular and plasmatic phases, the number of systems or antibody possibilities that may exist. We know that in the supernatant, there may be many pro-inflammatory mediators, as well as CD40 ligand, which may cause both febrile and allergic transfusion reactions. What's also interesting and important to note with platelet transfusions is this risk within the first few weeks of transplant of what's known as idiopathic pulmonary syndrome. So maybe this is a trolley-like phenomenon, though it may not have the smoking gun anti-leukocyte antibodies that are typical of classic or type 1 trolley. This table here speaks to special attributes that are product-specific considerations. So as you can see, ABO is relevant to platelets, red cells, and plasma, but not to plasma-derived factors. RHD is relevant to cellular blood products, and so too is the maneuver of irradiation. This doesn't apply to plasma. Plasma, which has no cryopreservative, has cells shattering on freeze thaw. So the physics of plasma thawing mitigates graft versus host disease. So there's no role of irradiation there. Special antigen typing is relevant in red cells across the red cell antigen systems to the extent that you want to give superficial or deep matches. And in platelets, the systems of interest there are chiefly HLA plus or minus HPA. And if you don't have these to choose from, well, then ABO may also be favored in the interim. You can see that CMV seronegativity is no longer a consideration in any scenario because we consider our leukoreduced blood supply as equivalent to the maneuver of sourcing products from a CMV seronegative donor. Washing or plasma volume reduction can apply to our cellular products. Platelets have a great deal of plasma that can be stripped away, but red cells only have about 2 to 20 mils. Red cells can be PVR'd or washed, but platelets, at least in our hands, can only be PVR'd. We have not been successful with the washing of our platelet products. We don't get good yields, and the platelets don't look like they can perform suitably for infusion. People who need products from donors who are IgA deficient are those who themselves are IgA deficient and anti-IgA IgG counter-sensitized with associated anaphylaxis. And so an IgA deficient donor is an ideal provider of platelets, red cells, or plasma. Solvent detergent treated plasma is also an option, and this is going to be the takeover material of our raw plasma inventory by fall of 2023 here in Canada. Pathogen inactivation or pathogen reduction is also going to be the new attribute of platelets coming this fall in 2023 to us at the Brampton location of Canadian Blood Services. I like this tweet here, which speaks to just how much various surveillance agencies may know about individuals, but how little our healthcare system does. Our patients are far more portable than their health information is, and that's an incredible irony. So we use cards to overcome these fragmentation situations to serve as bridges. An example of the UHN issued card is shown here. You've got your antigen profile on one side and your antibody repertoire on another, but this isn't speaking to the other special needs that a person may have. We've noted from our CAR T-cell colleagues that high-risk cell therapy alert cards have been given to our patients as well. So a list of various adoptive or selective cell plus or minus gene therapies is shown here because this is relevant to flagging that individual for a need for irradiated blood products. Cell therapies to pave the way for the tolerance of the infused material often get preempted with conditioning regimens like fludarabine, which will set someone up for the risk of engraftment by unintended viable lymphocytes coming from concomitant cellular components like platelets or red cells. We put out a medical staff bulletin a few years ago after we had some incidents relating to individuals who, though they had wallet cards speaking to their historic red cell antibody repertoire, nevertheless didn't present them in time for them to get appropriately matched products. And so we wanted to cue our various support staff who register our patients, who take heed of Jehovah's Witness cards or private insurance cards, to place them in the appropriate rooms that they're entitled to also ask about these antibody or special blood needs cards, and to be aware that these need to be communicated to the blood bank. So this is speaking to the challenge of various communication systems. On the one hand, you can have a super knowledgeable active product ordering practitioner who keeps sight of everything, but the reality is that we're quite fallible and we're often not on the ball and aware of all of these things and asking about them at all times to get the patient fully caught up to their needs. And so doctor-patient education can cue the patient to be their own advocate. And again, cards and letters in the patient's hand can speak for them if they don't remember what to say about their special needs. At the computer practitioner interface, there may be educational prompts, best practice alerts, and decision support built in to remind the clinician of what to ask for in terms of special needs. But ideally, our systems would be so automated that they would connect the dots and sense the medications and the ICD codes that are relevant to specific product modifications that a patient is entitled to. For example, enhanced red cell matching if you have sickle cell disease, or irradiation if you've ever been through any kind of cell therapy. So we ask who runs a blood bank and who runs the stem cell lab, and are the information systems shared? Because to the extent that this becomes realized is the extent to which the systems can co-communicate all needs. The Alloantibody Exchange is an interesting nonprofit organization that seeks to create a registry of information on all the antibodies that a patient may have had under their belt, because we appreciate that these may evanesce. Now let's talk about the different types of graft versus host disease. There's transfusion-associated graft versus host disease, BMT-associated graft versus host disease, and solid organ transplant graft versus host disease. Transfusion-associated graft versus host disease is the most lethal kind. This is an HLA attack without having stem cells present as the buffer or as the savior material. The marrow empties out and all tissues of the host fall under attack: skin, hepatobiliary, gut, and lung. Red cell graft versus host disease, or passenger lymphocyte syndromes, have not really been described, with the exception of this one Gilstad case report, where a Group O fresh whole blood donor led not only to HLA-based graft versus host disease, but to a hemolytic anti-A passenger lymphocyte syndrome concomitantly with an HLH-like presentation at the same time. So a very interesting case report that showed that both HLA and serologic or hemolytic passenger lymphocyte syndrome type GVHDs were possible with a transfusion. With stem cell transplants, we definitely appreciate that BMTs can cause HLA-based graft versus host disease, cytotoxic T cell activity against the host, and also, per the Naomi construct, the TAOs, that you can have red cell attack or passenger lymphocyte syndromes. Solid organs, too, have had both kinds of GVHD, HLA-based cytotoxic T cell attack of the recipient, as well as I've shown, red cell attack and hemolytic passenger lymphocyte syndromes. For transfusion-associated graft versus host disease, lethal viability comes from lymphocytes that are still present within the first 14 days of storage. The good news is there are no cases of transfusion-associated graft versus host disease ever described for products that have been stored for more than 14 days. And what you can see, again, is that there are no worries from frozen plasma or purified protein products that don't have any viable cells to speak of. This figure here on the right is illustrating what products carry a risk. So because platelets only store for 7 days, all of them are at risk of conveying graft versus host disease, but because red cells are typically dispensed well after the 14-day point, half of red cells are dispensed after the 3-week point. In fact, these are probably not the chief mediators of graft versus host disease. So if somebody got non-irradiated blood products, you're gating on or focusing on those products that were red cells before the 14-day point in any platelet transfusion. When we did a systematic review of all known or published cases of GVHD, we looked to see what systems were under attack, and indeed, they were all the systems that were expressing HLA that you would guess would be the subject of attack. The case fatality rate was incredibly high at 90%, and death occurred at a median of 24 days after the implicated transfusion. And this here is the scatter plot on the right of what the ranges are, with some people dying quite a time afterwards. So about a quarter of these cases could occur anytime after the 24-day point and up to 1,000 days. But that is rare. So how do we prevent transfusion-associated graft versus host disease? We irradiate the cellular blood product, or we give pathogen inactivated products. And pathogen inactivation or pathogen reduction is something that is only currently applied to platelets. Canadian Blood Services has adopted the Serous Intercept system, which uses amethoxylin as the photosensitizer subjected to UVA irradiation to cause damage to any nucleic acids. This intercalation and irradiation leads to cross-linking and destruction. And so any pathogen that expresses a nucleic acid of any kind, viruses, bacteria, parasites, as well as still viable lymphocytes or leukocytes, will be subject to destruction by this pathogen reduction technology. So this is the stand-in for irradiation if it's already applied for the primary purpose of Bacon mitigation. We don't irradiate all products for everyone because radionuclides are in short supply and expensive, and many hospitals hesitate to have these radionuclide holding licenses because they do increase the security burden. So there is a risk of theft of radionuclide, which could be misused for terroristic purposes, for example. And the inventory effects are not great. And so once you've irradiated a product, you accelerate the storage lesion and diminish the product's function as well. So we would not want to give irradiated products to someone who doesn't need irradiated products, though we certainly cross those materials over to prevent their outdate because it would be awful to throw that more expensive and modified product out. Irradiation increases potassium leak, and so transfusion-associated hyperkalemia, TAC, not TACO, is another risk to consider with the administration of these agents, especially if many days after the active irradiation itself. Transfusion-associated hyperkalemia can bring the recipient's blood potassium level up so high that they are at risk of Torsad and VTAC arrest. The National Advisory Committee on Blood and Blood Products in 2018 came out with new recommendations to deal with the harms and the inefficiencies of irradiation. They recommended narrower windows on red cell storage. So anything irradiated must be done so within the first 28 days of collection and must be transfused within 14 days within that 28th day point. So if you are irradiating on day 27, you only have 1 day left. If you don't have an irradiator, you can give blood products that have been stored for greater than 14 days because time, again, is like nature's irradiator. The NAC spoke to fewer groups being at risk of THGVHD than many prior policies would have stipulated. So BMT patients, instead of getting indefinite irradiation, can cease irradiation if this is an auto transplant after 1 year, and after 5 years after allotransplant if they are no longer on their GVHD prophylaxis. For lymphoid neoplasms, we no longer need to irradiate for all non-Hodgkin's lymphomas, but for Hodgkin's disease, we irradiate indefinitely. For immune disabling drugs, we also irradiate fludarabine, bendamustine, and limtuzumab, and ATG when given to those with aplastic anemia. We would irradiate for people with congenital T-cell immunodeficiencies, such as 22q deletion syndrome, and we would irradiate for immature immune systems. Irradiation is also applicable to product risks. So if it's a product going to an intrauterine transfusion, if it's a granulocyte transfusion, or if it's a designated, dedicated, or directed donor, then those products would be irradiated because those are at risk of immune stealth by virtue of HLA similarity. By being HLA similar enough to the recipient, for example, an HLA homozygous haploidentical donor, that product can't be seen as foreign by a recipient, but that graft could theoretically destroy the haplodisparate haplotype of the intended recipient. Now, is it possible to change your blood type after a solid organ transplant? This New England Journal of Medicine case report said yes. This was a description of a group O negative 9-year-old female who was the recipient of a liver from a group O positive 12-year-old male. 6 weeks after her transplant, she developed a rash and lymphopenia, and 9 months later, she had retyped with the blood type of her donor. So what seems to have happened was that this donor nearly killed her and saved her at the same time. There must have been a subpopulation of stem cells that came in on that liver graft so that when the passenger lymphocytes were eradicating her bone marrow, That graft stem cells filled that niche and repopulated her marrow with the new donor-derived erythropoietic blood type. Now to recap, what have we covered? There are 5 take-home messages from this session on transfusion and transplantation. The first point is just to appreciate the magnitude of activity in Ontario with about 1,000 solid organ transplants and 1,000 stem cell transplants every year and growing. Product support needs range from a dozen to a handful to nil or more, depending on your patient's unique needs. HLA sensitization imperils the graft and introduces many more risks. And crossing the barriers come at a cost of immunohematologic sequelae, more compromise, more antagonism. So we step in with blood matches that minimize recipient and donor harms. We prefer a red cell that is free of offending antigens with respect to the antibody repertoire of both the donor and the recipient, and we prefer plasma-containing products that are free of offending antibodies to the antigens expressed on either the recipient or the donor. And special needs include things like the preferred ABO type of the product, the RHD attribute of the product, graft versus host disease mitigation via radiation, and no longer worrying about CMV. Thank you for your attention.